California is at the center of this storm. In late 2024, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 1943, known as the Digital Age Assurance Act, into law. The compliance deadline is January 1, 2027, which sounds distant, but is actually quite close when you consider what the law demands. It requires operating system distributors to verify every user's age before they can access an app store or software repository. Not just verify it, but sort users into one of four specific brackets: under 13 to 15-16 to 17 or 18, and older. This verification has to happen through a real-time API call, meaning some system somewhere has to actively confirm someone's age bracket in the moment they try to download software. The penalties for getting this wrong are severe. A negligent violation costs $2,500 per affected child. An intentional one runs $7,500 per child for a volunteer project with no revenue. Those numbers are existential. California is not alone in this. Brazil has already enacted a similar law that is currently in force, and initial interpretations suggest it could apply to package management tools. Specifically, meanwhile, Colorado, Illinois, and New York have parallel proposals working through their own legislative processes. This is becoming a global wave, not an isolated California problem. What makes these laws particularly challenging is how they define their target. They speak of operating system distributors and app stores, which sounds straightforward enough. When you picture Apple or Google or Microsoft, each of those companies has account systems, legal departments, and engineering teams. They can build verification infrastructure because they already track their users, but the laws do not carve out exceptions for community-driven projects that operate without any of those things. The language is broad enough to sweep up entities that never imagined themselves in the regulatory crosshairs. The gap between what corporate operating system makers can do and what volunteer-run Linux distributions can accomplish is not just wide, it is a chasm measured in billions of dollars and decades of infrastructure investment. Apple, Google, and Microsoft approach age verification from positions of immense structural advantage. Each operates a walled garden where users are already tracked, identified, and accounted for. Every iPhone requires an Apple ID. Every Android device ties back to a Google account. Windows practically demands a Microsoft account during setup. These companies have spent years building systems that know who their users are, where they live, and how old they might be. Their legal departments employ hundreds of attorneys. Their government affairs teams lobby legislators and shape policy. When a new law requires age verification, these corporations can treat it as an engineering project. Expensive, yes, annoying, certainly, but survivable. Linux distributions exist in an entirely different reality. Arch, Debian, Fedora, Gentoo, Linux, Mint. These are not corporations. They are communities of volunteers scattered across the globe, maintaining free operating systems on donated time and donated hardware. Most have zero revenue, none employ legal counsel, and perhaps most critically, almost none maintain centralized user account systems of any kind. When someone downloads an Arch Linux ISO, nobody asks for a login. Nobody tracks the download to a specific person. Nobody collects demographic data. The entire model assumes anonymity by design. This is not an oversight, it is a philosophical commitment to user privacy and freedom. The result is a compliance gap that borders on the absurd. For Apple, implementing age verification means assigning engineers to write API endpoints and updating terms of service. For Debian, It would require building infrastructure that does not exist, funding legal analysis that cannot be afforded, and fundamentally transforming a distribution model built on trust and openness into something that resembles the corporate surveillance systems many users fled to Linux to escape. These are not comparable challenges. One is an engineering sprint. The other is an existential question about whether volunteer-run free software can survive in a regulatory environment designed exclusively for corporate platforms. Debian finds itself in a genuinely strange position. Here, the project does not fit into any of the categories that lawmakers imagined when they wrote these regulations. Current Debian project leader Andreas Till addressed this directly in a recent mailing list update, and his analysis cuts to the heart of the problem. Debian does not sell software. It does not have customers in any traditional sense. The entire project runs on volunteer labor and operates in a highly decentralized way that defies easy categorization. Till wrote that from his non-lawyer perspective, it is genuinely unclear how regulations like California's Digital Age Assurance Act would even apply to a non-commercial volunteer-driven project. The law seems designed around the assumption that someone somewhere is running a business. But Debian is not a business. It is a community publishing a free operating system for anyone who wants it. Till's preliminary thinking suggests that if any obligations exist, they would probably fall on redistributors or commercial entities building products on top of Debian, rather than on Debian itself. This makes a certain amount of sense when a company takes Debian and turns it into a commercial product. That company has resources and infrastructure. They have legal teams. They have user accounts. They can comply with regulations. The upstream project, by contrast, has none of those things. Debian and software in the public interest, which serves as the project's legal steward, are actively seeking formal legal guidance on these questions. Nothing is settled yet, but Till has already signaled Debian's stance. If downstream distributors need features to meet regulatory requirements, Debian would welcome those contributions. The project just wants to keep such features optional for users in jurisdictions where they are not required. It is a pragmatic approach that acknowledges the problem without forcing solutions on users who do not need them. So what does compliance actually look like when you strip away all the legal complexity? The technical infrastructure being developed right now is surprisingly minimal. Systemd has added a birthdate field to its user database, and XDG Desktop Portal is building an age verification portal that would allow Flatpak applications to query that information. The portal would read the birthdate from systemd's UserDB and share it with applications that request it. But here's the crucial detail: these fields are entirely optional. There's no verification mechanism whatsoever. A user can leave their birth date blank, or they can enter a date that's completely fabricated. The system has no way to check whether someone claiming to be born in 1970 is actually 55 years old or a 12-year-old typing whatever they want. This is not a bug or an oversight. It is the entire point. The implementation mirrors how systemd already handles other optional user data fields like email address and real name have existed for years, and nobody verifies those either. They are convenience fields that applications can optionally read and use. The birthdate field works the same way. The consensus among developers has been to share only age brackets rather than full birth dates when applications request this information. So, instead of telling an app that you were born on March 15, 1982, the system would simply report that you fall into the 18 and over bracket. This approach represents what minimal compliance looks like. It provides a mechanism for age signals to flow from the operating system to applications. It satisfies the technical requirement that such a mechanism exist, but it does not attempt to solve the much harder problem of actually verifying anyone's age. Whether that satisfies regulators is an entirely different question, and one that nobody can answer yet. So how are actual distributions responding to these laws? The answers range from pragmatic to drastic, and they reveal just how fragmented the open source world really is when facing a shared legal threat. Let us start with the most dramatic response. Midnight Haste. A small BSD distribution has already blocked California IP addresses entirely. The project essentially decided that compliance is impossible. For a volunteer effort with no legal budget and no infrastructure to verify anyone's age, rather than risk penalties that could reach thousands of dollars per violation, they simply excluded an entire state from accessing their software. It is a nuclear option, but one that makes a certain kind of sense when you are a small project staring down liabilities that could bankrupt a small country. On the other end of the spectrum, Canonical is taking a far more measured approach. The company behind Ubuntu is reviewing the legislation with legal counsel, which is exactly what you would expect from an organization with actual resources. But the more interesting discussions are happening among community developers. They have been exploring an optional dbus interface called org free desktop. Age of verification 1. The idea here is surprisingly elegant. Instead of sending user data to some external verification service, the operating system would handle age brackets locally. An administrator sets a birth date. The system calculates which bracket the user falls into, and applications can query that information through a standard interface. No telemetry, no phone home mechanisms, no privacy invasion. Just a local setting that respects user autonomy while still providing the technical hooks that laws like AB 43 seem to require. Then, there is Elementary OS, which appears likely to inherit whatever Ubuntu implements, since Elementary builds on Ubuntu's foundation. The path of least resistance would be adopting the same technical infrastructure upstream. This creates an interesting cascade effect, where one major distribution's decisions ripple outward to all its downstream derivatives. What emerges from this picture is not coordination, but happenstance. Each project is making its own calculations based on its own resources, its own risk tolerance, and its own understanding of what these laws actually require. Some are building technical solutions. Some are consulting lawyers. Some are simply pulling up the drawbridge and walking away. Here is what makes this situation particularly difficult to watch unfold during the legislative process for these age verification laws. The open source community was essentially absent from the conversation. The Open Source Initiative, the Free Software Foundation, and the Linux Foundation provided no formal testimony. That means lawmakers crafted these regulations without ever hearing from the people who maintain the software infrastructure that powers a significant portion of the Internet. The entire sector was unrepresented, and there is reason to believe the current laws are just the beginning. Texas HB 131 suggests a trajectory towards something far more demanding than self-reported age brackets. If legislation moves toward verified identification, the technical infrastructure being discussed right now becomes irrelevant. A birth date field in a user database is meaningless if the law requires third-party verification of government identification. The core tension here is that these laws were written For corporate platforms, they assume a central authority with legal teams and compliance officers, and registered business entities. They cannot simply be applied to community projects without fundamentally breaking how open-source distribution works. A volunteer project cannot become a corporation just because a law expects one to exist. This raises an existential question that nobody seems eager to answer. Can volunteer-run projects survive in jurisdictions that demand corporate-level compliance infrastructure? The question is not rhetorical, it is practical. And it is urgent.